It was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. My daughter, Emma, had spent months planning her dream wedding. The venue was perfect, a lovely community hall with a beautiful garden surrounded by tall trees, a peaceful neighborhood with charming homes, and a perfect atmosphere for a spring wedding. Everything was set for the big day. But just hours before the ceremony, an unexpected storm brewed, one that had nothing to do with the weather. The first sign of trouble came when we were setting up for the ceremony. The garden was full of decorations, the chairs were arranged, and the music was ready. But out of nowhere, a woman in her mid-50s stormed into the venue. Her face was red with anger, and she marched right up to my wife, Carol, and me. "Excuse me," she shouted. "You're violating HOA regulations, and I demand you shut this down immediately." This was no ordinary guest. She was none other than Linda, a notorious Karen from the neighborhood. Linda had been the subject of numerous neighborhood complaints for years, always ready to escalate even the smallest disagreements. It wasn't an exaggeration when people referred to her as that neighbor, the one who couldn't resist calling the cops at the slightest infraction. Whether it was a parked car slightly blocking her driveway or the wrong color of flowers planted by a neighbor, Linda was infamous for her obsession with rules. If you didn't follow every single letter of the HOA guidelines, you could be sure she would be the first to report it. No one in the neighborhood had escaped her judgment, and now it was our turn. It was ironic, considering she had no real stake in our event, other than her need to control everything around her. Linda had no ties to the wedding itself, no familial connection, no personal bond. She wasn't even friends with us or Emma, our daughter. Her only connection to the wedding was the fact that it took place in the neighborhood, and somehow that was enough for her to feel entitled to impose her will. Emma, as a young woman starting her life, had always dreamed of a beautiful, peaceful wedding day, free from drama and distractions. And yet, there Linda was, standing in the middle of our planned celebration, ready to ruin everything. Linda didn't waste any time. As soon as she stepped onto the property, she began inspecting every inch of the setup with her eagle-eyed gaze. It was as though she had come on a mission, not to enjoy the wedding but to find every single flaw. She scowled at the flower arrangements, shaking her head as though she had found some egregious violation. The colors of the bouquets, the ribbon on the chairs, it was all wrong in her eyes. Then, Linda's gaze shifted to the music system we had set up for the ceremony. The soft strings of classical music were supposed to serenade the guests, setting a calm, romantic atmosphere for the ceremony to begin. But Linda, ever the perfectionist, found that the volume was too loud for her liking. "The sound level is against the HOA regulations," she muttered under her breath, though there was no such rule about volume level in the HOA guidelines. But Linda was far from concerned with accuracy. She was more concerned with making sure she could flex her power over the community. And it didn't stop there. Linda's wrath shifted to the seating arrangements next. The chairs, which had been set up with great care, were spaced just right for guests to sit comfortably and view the ceremony. But in Linda's eyes, the spacing was all wrong. It wasn't the recommended perfect alignment she had in her mind. Oh no, not nearly enough. She began to count the rows of chairs aloud, criticizing the width between them as though the seating arrangement was the most critical issue in the world. She huffed and puffed with each chair she scrutinized, and I could see the tension in her body as she raked her eyes over every detail. To make matters worse, Linda didn't even try to be discreet. She marched up to my wife, Carol, and me, demanding we fix everything immediately. "This is outrageous. The HOA rules are very clear," she fumed. "None of this is compliant, and I won't stand for it. I'll have to call the authorities." Carol's face fell as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had been so excited about the wedding. Every detail had been meticulously planned, and now here was this woman, creating unnecessary drama. She looked at me for support, but I was in complete shock. We hadn't even started the ceremony yet, and already, our big day was under threat from a woman who didn't even have the decency to try to be reasonable. Carol politely tried to explain that everything was in line with the guidelines, but Linda wasn't having it. In her mind, the rules were always black and white, and if there was even a hint of a gray area, she was determined to correct it, no matter the cost. "You think I'm just going to let you break the rules on my watch?" Linda spat, her face reddening with indignation. Before we could say another word, Linda pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number for the local authorities. "I'll have this entire wedding shut down," she declared loudly, speaking into the phone as though we were criminals. She started rattling off complaints to the dispatcher, listing every tiny infraction she had found, making the whole situation sound like a criminal enterprise. "Yes, I'm at venue address, and there's a wedding here that's violating HOA rules. The decorations are all wrong, the music is too loud, and the chairs aren't set up properly. You need to send someone right away." She spoke so frantically into the phone that she didn't even give the dispatcher a chance to respond. It was as though she had already made up her mind about the outcome, and she believed that all her calls for help were guaranteed to result in action. It was clear that Linda had never been one to back down once she decided to make something a battle. The worst part was that the police were going to arrive any minute. They had no reason to be there, and we knew that once the authorities showed up, the whole vibe of the wedding would change. The joy and excitement we had been anticipating for months would be replaced with the uncomfortable presence of law enforcement, all because of a single woman who thought she had the right to dictate how everyone else lived. And Linda didn't care. She was so fixated on the idea of enforcing rules that she couldn't even see how her actions were harming others. For her, it was all about control. She had no interest in listening to reason or trying to understand the situation. To Linda, the idea that a wedding could exist outside of the rigid confines of her rules was a crime in itself. Her incessant complaining only grew louder, and it felt like we were standing in a pressure cooker ready to explode. The tension in the air was palpable. Every moment felt like a ticking time bomb, and my anxiety grew with each second. As Linda continued to drone on about regulations and how she was saving the neighborhood from chaos, I had never felt so helpless. My daughter's big day, which was supposed to be a beautiful, joyful occasion, was being hijacked by a woman who had no business being involved. We were running out of time, and I could see the guests arriving, looking at the scene unfolding outside, unsure of what was going on. Their smiles faded as they realized something was wrong, and I could hear whispers of confusion spreading through the crowd. Nobody wanted this. Nobody wanted Linda's brand of chaos interrupting our family's happiness. But Linda was unwavering. She wasn't interested in letting us salvage the situation. She had made up her mind, and the rules, her rules, were all that mattered. For her, the joy of a wedding didn't compare to her obsession with enforcing conformity, no matter how trivial or insignificant the violation might have been. As the seconds ticked away and Linda continued her tirade, I could feel the weight of her presence, crushing the spirit of what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of our lives. But little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would ultimately put her in her place in a way she never expected. We stood there, completely frozen for a moment, as Linda's voice rose higher and higher, her angry words echoing through the garden. Her face was a mix of fury and self-righteousness, and every word that came out of her mouth seemed designed to make us feel guilty, even though we hadn't done anything wrong. My wife, Carol, was nearly in tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her wedding planner binder, the one she had spent weeks perfecting. She tried to speak, to reason with Linda, but her voice quivered, barely audible against the storm of Linda's accusations. "I can't believe this is happening," Carol whispered, tears threatening to spill down her face. She had been dreaming of this day for as long as I could remember. It was supposed to be a celebration of our daughter's love, a moment where our family and friends would come together to witness the beginning of a new chapter. But now, here we were, at the mercy of a woman who thought she had the right to dictate how we lived our lives. It wasn't just about a wedding. To Linda, this was another opportunity to assert her control, and she wasn't going to back down. Emma, our daughter, was backstage, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. She had been so excited about this day, every moment of it carefully curated, every detail chosen with love. She had spent countless hours picking out the perfect dress, designing the invitations, and even choosing the food and music. Emma wanted nothing more than to marry the man she loved, surrounded by friends and family, without a single hitch. Yet, here we were, standing in a nightmare that felt like it was going to swallow up everything. The tension in the air was palpable. I could see the guests trickling in, one by one, walking up to the venue with confused expressions on their faces. The beautiful, sunlit day that had greeted us when we arrived was now overshadowed by the storm that Linda was so determined to create. The noise from Linda's ranting filled the air, every word cutting into the joy we'd been anticipating for so long. Her voice, shrill and demanding, carried through the venue, and I saw the looks of unease spreading among the guests. They had come here for a celebration, but now they were witnessing a confrontation. I could feel the mood shift as people exchanged glances, unsure of what was going to happen next. The clock was ticking. I glanced at my watch. 30 minutes until the ceremony was supposed to begin. But the way things were going, I had no idea if we would even be able to start on time. Linda seemed to be oblivious to the significance of the day, her focus entirely on her own sense of righteousness. She had no regard for the fact that people had traveled for hours, that Emma's dream wedding was slipping further and further out of reach with each passing second. Linda wasn't interested in our joy. She was only interested in making sure her idea of order and compliance was maintained, no matter the cost. It didn't matter that this was our daughter's wedding. To her, it was just another battle in the war she waged against any perceived slight to the rules. I could feel the excitement in the air begin to fade. Where there had been laughter, there was now discomfort. Where there had been anticipation, there was now dread. Linda's incessant shouting had done something to the atmosphere. It was as if a cloud had descended, darkening everything. The wedding that was meant to be a light, joyous occasion was turning into a battle. And for what? Because Linda had decided that the placement of the chairs was a violation of some obscure rule. Because the music volume wasn't quite to her exact specifications. Because she believed her interpretation of the HOA guidelines was the only valid one. Carol tried once more to reason with her. Linda, please. We've done everything we can to make sure this is in line with the rules. This is a wedding, a day of love, and we don't want to fight. We just want to celebrate Emma and Luke's love. But Linda wasn't listening. In fact, it seemed as though my wife's words only fueled Linda's fire. You think I care about your pathetic wedding? She scoffed, crossing her arms. I'm here to make sure that no one gets away with breaking the rules. You can't just throw a party like this without following the guidelines. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted another potential violation. Look at these balloons, she snapped. They're the wrong color. They don't match the HOA-approved scheme. How could you be so careless? I could feel the anger rising in me. This was not how this day was supposed to go. I had spent months helping my daughter prepare for this moment, planning, organizing, and ensuring that everything was perfect. And now, this woman, the stranger to us, was threatening to ruin it all with her petty, pointless complaints. But despite the growing frustration, I knew I had to keep my cool. I couldn't let Linda see how much she was affecting me, how much she was affecting our family. That was when she made the call. She whipped out her phone and, without hesitation, dialed the local police. Her voice, trembling with indignation, was raised even further as she barked into the phone. Yes, I need help. There's a wedding here that's violating HOA regulations, and I need you to send someone immediately. They're disturbing the peace, playing loud music, and the decorations are completely inappropriate. This event must be stopped. I could hardly believe it. This woman, standing in the middle of what was supposed to be our daughter's happiest day, was actively calling the police, trying to sabotage everything. I had never felt so powerless. The words that came out of Linda's mouth felt like daggers in my chest, and I couldn't escape the pit that had formed in my stomach. The dream wedding that I had pictured for Emma was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I could see the confusion on the faces of the guests as they overheard Linda's side of the conversation. Some began to look at each other nervously, unsure if they should stay or leave. They had come here for a celebration, for joy, not for a scene like this. They were the first to feel the tension, before Carol and I, before Emma had even arrived. They were already absorbing the negative energy that Linda was so eager to create. The buzz of excitement, the happy chatter, the smiles that were supposed to be everywhere, those things were slowly being replaced by a heavy silence. As the clock continued to tick, I found myself at a crossroads. I was supposed to be walking my daughter down the aisle in 30 minutes, but instead, I was standing in the middle of a confrontation that had no place in a wedding. Linda, determined as ever, wasn't backing down. And as for the rest of us, we were left scrambling, desperately trying to salvage what was left of our celebration. I glanced at the entrance. The guests who had arrived early were beginning to trickle into the venue, no longer smiling or chatting, their faces concerned and confused. The joyful atmosphere had been completely stripped away, replaced with a tension that I knew would linger long after the last guest left. The anticipation that had once filled the air had now been replaced with uncertainty. Everything was changing. My daughter's wedding, the most important day of her life, was quickly becoming a nightmare, and it wasn't even her fault. It was all because of one woman, one unrelenting person, who refused to let up. Her call to the police was the final straw, but the damage was already done. The wedding was supposed to be a beautiful, memorable moment, something our family would cherish forever. But right now, it felt like it might be ruined, all because of Linda's need to control, to enforce her idea of order, no matter the cost. We still had 30 minutes, but with each passing second, I knew it was going to take a miracle to get this day back on track. Just as I was about to lose my cool, a voice, calm yet authoritative, cut through the mounting tension. "Is there a problem here?" The sound was like a breath of fresh air, and for a split second, it felt like the world slowed down. We all turned toward the voice. There, standing with the kind of confidence that you can't fake, was a tall man in a sharp suit. His posture was upright, shoulders squared, and he had his hands calmly resting in his pockets. Despite the storm that had been brewing around us, this man stood unaffected. There was no aggression in his stance, no attempt to overpower the situation with forceful words or an imposing presence. His mere presence, however, was enough to command attention. He didn't look angry. In fact, his face was a picture of quiet control, like someone who had seen many situations like this before and knew how to handle them. Linda, however, was far from impressed. Her face, already flushed with anger, twisted further as she realized someone was interrupting her tirade. She was ready to turn her attention to this new person, to unleash her fury once more, but something about the man's demeanor told me that he wasn't someone she could intimidate. I braced myself, expecting another confrontation, but instead of shouting or making demands, the man raised one hand, palm open, signaling that he wanted to calm things down. "I think we should all take a breath and talk this out," he said in a steady, soothing voice. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight, and for a moment, I could see Linda hesitate. She looked at him, her lips still parted as if she were about to unleash another complaint, but the words never came. Something about the way he held himself, the way he stood there, radiated calm authority in a way that felt genuine, not manufactured. This wasn't someone who needed to shout or bully their way into getting what they wanted. This man exuded a quiet power, the kind that comes with experience, the kind that people naturally defer to in moments of conflict. The moment of hesitation stretched on, and I could see Linda's mind racing. Her eyes darted from the man's face to the crowd of onlookers who had gathered by now. I could see the thoughts running through her head. Who was this person? Why was he intervening? But she couldn't quite process it in time before the man spoke again. "I'm sure we can all find a way to settle this," he continued, his voice unshaken by the tension in the air. "But let's not do it like this, in front of all these people. I'm sure that's not what anyone wants." I could see Linda's walls start to crack. She was the type of person who thrived on control, on being the loudest voice in the room, and yet, this man wasn't backing down from her. He was simply refusing to be drawn into her emotional turmoil. Instead of becoming defensive, he offered a solution. He didn't accuse her, didn't belittle her. He simply gave her a chance to reconsider her actions. I looked closer at him, trying to place where I had seen him before. He wasn't someone I had personally interacted with much, but his face was vaguely familiar. The more I thought about it, the more it clicked. I'd seen him at several neighborhood meetings over the years, standing in the back, while others argued about minor issues like property lines or noise complaints. He was a city council member, one of the few who actually seemed to care about the neighborhood beyond just enforcing rules. I had never spoken to him directly, but I had heard his name whispered among the more thoughtful residents, John Thompson. As the pieces started to come together, my eyes naturally moved to his lapel. There, pinned to his jacket, was a small, official-looking badge that confirmed what I had already suspected. It was a city council pin, gold and neat, sitting proudly on his left side. A man of importance, no doubt, but not the kind of importance that came with arrogance or a power trip. This man wasn't here to play politics. He was here to solve a problem, to bring peace where there had been nothing but chaos. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. Just knowing that someone with actual authority was intervening in the situation made all the difference. For the first time since this wedding drama had started, I had hoped that we might be able to resolve things without further escalation. I glanced over at Carol, who had stopped wiping away tears, and saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes too. We had been so caught up in the madness, so overwhelmed by Linda's actions, that we hadn't even considered that someone might actually step in to help us. Linda, meanwhile, had stopped her rant. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. I could see her trying to process the situation, trying to figure out how to regain control. She had probably never met someone like John Thompson before, someone who could disarm her without raising his voice, someone who could dismantle her arguments simply by being calm and reasonable. I watched her eyes narrow, her lips pressing into a thin line as she tried to find a way to reassert her dominance. But John wasn't fazed. He didn't wait for Linda to speak. He simply turned his attention to Carol and me, addressing us directly. "I know this must be a stressful situation," he said, his gaze softening as he looked at Carol's tear-streaked face. "I'm sure you've worked hard to make today special, and it's a shame that it's been disrupted like this. But I promise you, this isn't worth the stress. We'll get this all sorted out." For the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath. His words, his calm demeanor, his genuine interest in putting things right. Everything about him felt like a balm to the chaos we'd been dealing with. I realized, in that moment, that not all hope was lost. There was someone here who wasn't just going to watch as everything fell apart. John gave Linda a long look, and for a moment, there was a silent standoff between the two of them. It was as if they were sizing each other up. Linda, her fists still clenched at her sides, glared at him, but the fire in her eyes seemed to dim just a little bit, replaced by confusion. She wasn't used to being the one who wasn't in control, and I could tell that this shift in power left her rattled. For once, she was the one on the defensive, and I could see it beginning to eat at her. After what felt like an eternity of tense silence, Linda finally broke her stare and huffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, "but I'm watching this." John smiled slightly, as if he'd expected this. He nodded toward her, acknowledging her stance without confrontation. "I'm sure you are," he said quietly. Then he turned back to us, addressing the room once more. "Now, let's make sure everything is in order so we can get this wedding back on track." The atmosphere began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Guests who had been standing awkwardly on the edges of the yard started to relax, no longer caught in the crossfire of Linda's tirade. The music, still faint in the background, seemed to settle back into its original place, filling the space with a soft, soothing melody. People began to move again, gathering their things, finding their seats, the earlier discomfort easing as John stepped in. It wasn't a miraculous fix. Linda hadn't backed down completely, but it was enough. Enough for us to finally catch our breath. Enough for the ceremony to continue without the looming threat of further chaos. I could finally see a glimmer of hope that this wedding wouldn't be overshadowed by the drama. John had given us that hope, and it was more than I had expected in this moment of uncertainty. As John spoke with Linda briefly, I turned to Carol, my heart finally settling. She smiled at me, though the exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster was still visible on her face. "I think we might actually be okay," she whispered, a slight laugh escaping her lips. And for the first time in what felt like hours, I agreed. Before Linda could continue her rant, a voice, calm and clear, cut through the air with the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. "Is there a problem here?" We all turned, as if reacting in unison, to the source of the voice. A tall man stood there, confidently positioned in the middle of the chaos, his eyes scanning the situation with a practiced calm. His posture was upright, and his presence imposing, but not through forceful intimidation. No, this man emanated a kind of quiet power that demanded attention without ever needing to shout. He was wearing a sharp suit that seemed to subtly proclaim his importance, and his expression wasn't angry or frustrated. It was composed, even reassuring. Linda, who had been building her angry case against the wedding in increasingly frantic tones, froze for a moment. Her gaze shifted from the man in the suit to the crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather, their faces now filled with curiosity and apprehension, and then back to him again. She clearly wasn't prepared for this sudden interruption. For a moment, I thought she might launch into another tirade, but this man, whoever he was, had caught her off guard. He didn't give her a chance to start her verbal assault again. With a small, deliberate movement, he raised his hand, not in an accusatory gesture, but rather in a way that suggested peace. He wasn't trying to take control, but to calm the escalating storm. "I think we should all take a breath and talk this out," he said in a voice so steady it seemed to settle the air around us. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to pause. The crowd, which had been anxious and uncertain, suddenly quieted as they absorbed his words. There was something about his demeanor, the calmness in his voice, that invited everyone to take a step back. It wasn't the forcefulness of an authority figure demanding compliance. It was the cool, collected approach of someone who knew exactly how to de-escalate a situation and wasn't going to let it spiral out of control. Linda, still visibly rattled from the shift in energy, stared at him, her mouth hanging open for just a fraction of a second. She was struggling, I could tell, to regain her footing in this new reality. She had been so intent on disrupting the wedding, so sure that she had the upper hand, that this interruption threw her completely off balance. The man took a step closer, his calm eyes never leaving Linda's. "It's clear we're all a little worked up here," he said, his voice smooth, carrying just enough weight to make it clear that this wasn't just an invitation to talk. It was a request to reconsider the entire scene that had been unfolding. "But I'm sure we can find a more appropriate way to address whatever concerns you may have." For a brief moment, I dared to hope. I didn't know who this man was yet, but his mere presence, his ability to stay calm in the face of Linda's storm, was having an immediate effect. I could already see that the situation had changed in that instant. The tension in the air, which had felt suffocating just moments ago, seemed to ease a little. It was as if he had opened a window and let the stuffy atmosphere breathe again. It was then that it hit me. I had seen him before. His face was familiar, and now that he was standing before us, I realized who he was. The man didn't look like an ordinary bystander. He had that air about him, the kind of authority that people either took seriously or chose to ignore at their peril. I had seen him at neighborhood council meetings, at local events, speaking occasionally about community issues, with the kind of calm confidence that others could only wish for. But now, seeing him here, I was struck by the realization of just how important this man was. This wasn't just some random visitor trying to quell a small neighborhood dispute. No, this was someone who held real power, someone whose words and actions could influence far more than a few HOA guidelines. This man was someone with the authority to make things happen. I glanced at his lapel, and sure enough, there it was, a small, discreet badge, one that carried all the weight of a city council pin. It was gold and polished, gleaming slightly in the sunlight, but it was the sort of badge that only those who held significant power could wear without the need to flaunt it. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any man. This was the mayor, Mayor John Thompson. I felt my heart skip a beat. The man standing before us, the one Linda had been trying to bully, the one she had assumed would bend to her will, was none other than the mayor of our city, the authority figure who had the power to shut down her entire rant with a single word, if he so desired. Linda, however, hadn't even registered it. She had been so consumed by her righteous indignation, so caught up in her own sense of moral superiority, that she had no idea who she was dealing with. Her gaze snapped to the badge, then back to the man, her confusion palpable. She seemed to search for an explanation, trying to make sense of the unexpected twist. The moment that followed was like something straight out of a movie. Linda's face, which had been flushed with anger, now turned a shade of red I had never seen before, deep crimson, almost as if the realization of who she had been confronting had physically struck her. She looked stunned, rattled to her core. "Why, you're the mayor," she stammered, her words nearly tripping over each other in her desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. For a second, it was like time stood still. The words seemed to hang in the air, and even the guests, who had been watching this unfold with wide eyes, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. I could feel a weight lift from my shoulders, the heavy pressure of anxiety giving way to a strange sense of relief. The man we had been waiting for to step in had arrived, and he wasn't just going to let this disruption continue. "Yes, I am," Mayor Thompson replied, his voice calm, yet now carrying a subtle undertone of authority. It wasn't the kind of power that demanded obedience. It was the kind of power that came from confidence, experience, and a deep understanding of what truly mattered. "And I don't think there's any issue here that needs to be addressed. This wedding is perfectly fine, and I don't believe your complaints hold any water." The words hung in the air like a declaration, solid and unyielding. Mayor Thompson didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone, his composed, measured delivery, was more than enough to cut through Linda's angry tirade and silence the room. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. Linda, who had just moments ago been ready to tear everything apart, was now disarmed, left standing in stunned silence. It was almost comical, the way she tried to muster a response. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could allow her to reclaim some form of authority. But there was nothing left for her to do. The room, which had been tense with nervous energy just moments ago, now seemed to exhale in collective relief. Even the guests, who had been caught between the spectacle of Linda's outburst and the hope of a peaceful resolution, seemed to relax, a small murmur of approval circulating among them. Linda's defiance didn't dissipate entirely, but it was clear that her game was over. She had picked the wrong person to target. The mayor, the one figure she couldn't intimidate, had finally spoken. And with those words, Linda was left standing there, her face a strange mixture of humiliation, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of realization that she had just tried to wage a battle she couldn't win. I turned to look at Carol, and I could see the relief in her eyes. She was no longer on the verge of tears, no longer consumed by the stress of trying to protect her daughter's day. We had been hanging on by a thread, but now, thanks to Mayor Thompson, it felt like the thread had finally snapped back into place, and the wedding could go on without the looming threat of disaster. Linda opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She had lost all of her steam. With a small, frustrated huff, she turned away from the mayor, her eyes burning with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "Fine," she muttered, her voice dripping with resentment. "But I'm watching you." The mayor's response was a simple nod, his expression unchanged. "I'm sure you are, Linda. But for now, I suggest we focus on what matters here." He turned toward us, his tone warm and reassuring. "Your daughter deserves the wedding she's been dreaming of, and I'm here to make sure she gets it." The crowd, which had been in limbo for what felt like hours, finally began to relax. Guests who had been standing awkwardly by the sidelines began to move toward their seats. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, started to feel like it was coming back to life. Emma, who had been backstage, was still unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. But now, with the mayor's intervention, we could finally move forward with the celebration. The room fell completely silent, as if time itself had paused. The collective breath of the crowd seemed to be held in anticipation, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. It was as though no one dared to even breathe, fearing that the wrong movement or sound would shatter the fragile calm that had descended. The guests who had gathered for the ceremony, family, friends, and loved ones, watched with wide eyes, unsure of what was going to happen next. Some looked at each other with uncertainty, others at the floor, unsure of how to navigate this unexpected tension. They had come for a wedding, a joyous occasion, but now they found themselves caught in the middle of a standoff that was anything but celebratory. A few whispers passed through the crowd, but no one dared to speak too loudly, not when the air felt so thick with the weight of the moment. Linda, on the other hand, was a picture of embarrassment. For all her earlier bravado and the fire with which she had stormed into the scene, she now stood there, completely deflated. The harshness of her words had faltered. Her hands that had been clenched into fists only moments ago now hung limp at her sides. Her face, which had been so flushed with anger earlier, was now a deep shade of crimson, though this time it was from the sting of humiliation rather than indignation. She had been so eager to make a scene, to force her will upon us, that she hadn't even stopped to think about who she was confronting. It was clear that she hadn't realized the level of authority she was dealing with until it was too late. Linda had believed she was in control, that she could make demands and twist everyone's arm to do things her way. She had become so accustomed to being the loudest voice in the room, to being the one who decided what was right and wrong, that she didn't stop to consider that there might be someone out there who could put her in her place, someone whose presence alone would be enough to stop her in her tracks. And now, standing before the very person she had thought would back her up, she could see that she was wrong. The room had shifted in an instant. Linda, for all her anger, was now the one left speechless. Mayor Thompson, whose calm demeanor had become the anchor in this storm of chaos, did not relent. He wasn't the type of person to gloat or make Linda feel small, but his words carried the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. There was no bitterness in his tone, no sense of superiority. He didn't need to shout or raise his voice. He simply spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had seen situations like this many times before and knew exactly how to handle them. "Look," Mayor Thompson continued, his voice steady, clear, and unwavering. "I'm aware of HOA regulations, but I can assure you, this wedding is within all the rules." His eyes remained locked on Linda, who was now visibly shrinking under the intensity of his gaze. "I don't appreciate you trying to ruin someone's special day." Every word he spoke seemed to land with precision, cutting through the fog of tension that had enveloped the room. It wasn't just that he was defending our wedding. It was that he was defending something far more important, the right to celebrate, to enjoy life's significant moments without having them hijacked by unnecessary drama. His tone was firm, but it wasn't harsh. He didn't need to belittle Linda to make his point. He was simply stating the facts, showing her exactly where she had gone wrong. For Linda, it was like a punch to the gut. She had expected to be in control, to have the upper hand in this situation, but instead, she was left standing there, caught off guard and completely out of her depth. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth worked as though she were trying to form a response, but she was so rattled by what had just happened that she couldn't find her voice. It was a rare sight to see Linda, who had prided herself on always having something to say, always being ready with the next accusation, standing there, stunned and unable to respond. The look on her face was a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. She couldn't fathom how she had gone from being the one demanding answers to being the one who had made a fool of herself. For a moment, it was almost comical. Her usual air of superiority had completely vanished, replaced with a flushed face and an expression that screamed, "I didn't expect this." It was a moment of reckoning that Linda was clearly not prepared for. She glanced around the room, perhaps hoping that someone would come to her defense, that someone would back up her claim that the wedding was somehow breaking the rules. But the faces she met weren't expressions of sympathy. They were expressions of quiet relief, of silent support for the mayor's intervention. It was as if the room had collectively breathed a sigh of relief, and Linda, for the first time, realized that she wasn't the one in control here. Linda's eyes flitted from person to person in the crowd, but no one seemed to share her perspective. The guests, who had been on edge, now exchanged subtle looks of approval toward Mayor Thompson, a few even nodding slightly in his direction. They could see what had just happened. They could see that Linda's behavior had been excessive, out of place, and frankly, unnecessary. No one was rushing to her aid. No one was supporting her claims. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being challenged. Most of the time, she managed to intimidate people, twist situations in her favor, or at the very least, leave them feeling so uncomfortable that they would back down. But this time, she had miscalculated. This time, she had come up against someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to her. Someone who had the power and the position to make things right without being swayed by her rants. The more Linda tried to process what had just occurred, the more she seemed to unravel. Her body stiffened. Her posture shifted from one of defiance to one of uncertainty. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers tapping nervously at her side. The facade she had been so sure of, a woman in control, enforcing the rules, taking charge, began to crack. The cracks were small at first, but they deepened with every second that passed without a response. Linda started to speak, but the words died on her lips. It was as though she had no idea how to respond. She wasn't just lost for words. She was lost in the realization that she had failed in every way possible. She had come in like a whirlwind, hoping to tear everything apart, but instead, she had exposed herself as someone who had no understanding of the real power dynamics at play. The crowd's eyes were on her now, and it wasn't with judgment, but with a sense of quiet amusement and disbelief. Linda was no longer the formidable figure she had once seemed. Instead, she was just another person, one who had overestimated her influence and made a fool of herself in the process. It wasn't a victory for us. It was simply the realization that, sometimes, justice didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It simply needed to be fair. The silence stretched on for a few long moments. The air, which had been thick with tension, felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted. Even the guests seemed to relax, as if they had been holding their collective breath. No one said a word, but everyone felt the shift. And yet, as the moment hung in the air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. This was the woman who had tried to derail our daughter's wedding, the one who had nearly turned a day of celebration into a nightmare. And now, she was just standing there, completely deflated. Finally, Linda exhaled sharply through her nose, a huff of frustration that spoke volumes about her internal struggle. She didn't like being bested. She didn't like losing control. And yet, here she was, defeated in front of an entire crowd, left to face the consequences of her own behavior. She didn't have the power anymore. It was gone, taken from her by the very person she had underestimated. The power she had tried so desperately to wield had slipped through her fingers. "Fine," she muttered, her voice dripping with resentment. "I'm not going to waste my time here." With that, she turned sharply on her heel, marching away from the scene with a dignity that was as thin as the air between us. It was clear that she was trying to maintain whatever shred of pride she had left, but the damage had already been done. And as she walked off, the crowd began to shift, the atmosphere returning to a sense of calm. Mayor Thompson, who had been the quiet force holding everything together, turned to Carol and me with a small, reassuring smile. "I think we can move on now," he said gently. And just like that, the chaos was over. The wedding, which had been on the verge of falling apart, could now continue. With Linda's complaints dismissed and the police call completely unnecessary, the atmosphere in the garden began to shift dramatically. The tension that had been hanging in the air like a dark cloud seemed to dissipate almost instantly. The oppressive silence that had surrounded the confrontation began to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet relief that spread through the crowd. It was as if a collective breath had been held for what felt like hours, and now, everyone could finally exhale. The guests, who had been standing uneasily, unsure of what was going to happen next, slowly began to relax. Faces that had been tense with anxiety softened, and the muttered whispers that rippled through the crowd were filled with relief. People who had been unsure whether they should stay or leave now shifted in their seats, a few exchanging nervous but grateful glances as if to say, "We made it through." A few guests who had been on the edge of the action, watching the drama unfold with concern, now turned to their friends and family, quietly commenting on how it seemed like everything would be okay. They had witnessed the tension, the uncertainty, and now, with the storm of Linda's complaints vanquished, they could feel that the atmosphere had changed. The warmth of the day, the joyous purpose of the occasion, was returning, and it wasn't just the weather that made everything feel brighter. It was the fact that the day had been salvaged, that the wedding wasn't going to be derailed by one person's misguided attempts to control everything. The guests who had been standing at the back began to shuffle into their seats, finally settling down. People began to murmur in conversation, shifting back into their original, celebratory roles. Some of the quieter individuals, who had been hesitant to join the festivities earlier, began to smile again. A few whispered their congratulations to Emma's parents, while others exchanged light-hearted comments about how everything was almost too dramatic for a wedding. The nervous energy that had hung around like an unwanted guest now felt like a distant memory. In the midst of this transformation, Emma, who had been backstage preparing for the ceremony, heard the commotion. She had been on edge herself, sensing something was wrong but unsure of the details. The sound of Linda's shrill voice had reached her, and though she hadn't understood the full extent of what had happened, she had caught enough of the conversation to know that something had gone awry. She had been told that everything was under control, but she couldn't shake the nervous feeling in the pit of her stomach. Stepping into the light, Emma looked around, her eyes scanning the crowd for her family. And then, her gaze landed on him, the man who had made everything right. She instantly recognized him. Mayor John Thompson. She had seen him at several neighborhood events, at local gatherings, and even during a few city council meetings, where his calm, collected demeanor had always made him stand out. She'd never imagined that the mayor would be the one to step in and save the day at her wedding. But there he was, standing confidently amidst the crowd, with the weight of the situation already behind him. Without a moment's hesitation, Emma rushed toward him, her face lighting up with gratitude. The relief in her expression was almost tangible. As she approached, her feet moving quickly despite her stunning wedding dress, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief, thanks, and even a sense of awe at how one person had been able to restore order when it seemed like everything was falling apart. She reached him in a few quick strides and, without any self-consciousness, threw her arms around him in a hug. "Thank you so much for stepping in," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. She pulled back, looking up at him with tears in her eyes, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You really saved the day. I don't even know what we would have done without you." Mayor Thompson smiled warmly, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes as he nodded. He wasn't one to bask in praise, but his humility was part of what made him so approachable. His calm presence had diffused a potentially disastrous situation, and now he was here, acknowledging Emma's gratitude with a quiet kindness. "It's my pleasure," he said, his tone gentle but assured. "I'm just happy to make sure you get the wedding you deserve. Everyone deserves to have their special day without any unnecessary stress, and I'm glad I could help bring things back on track." Emma's eyes shone with appreciation. Her heart, which had been racing with anxiety just moments before, now felt lighter. The man she had thought of only in passing as a city official had turned out to be exactly what her wedding needed in its moment of crisis: a calm, steady hand to guide them through the storm. As Emma pulled herself together, the full weight of the moment began to settle over her. This wedding wasn't just about the flowers or the dresses or even the perfect pictures. It was about the people who made it possible. Her parents, Luke, and now Mayor Thompson, had all contributed to keeping this day on course. Without their intervention, this beautiful day could have easily become a source of regret. But now, with Linda's complaints behind them and the mayor's reassurance, it was clear that the ceremony could move forward. With the tension finally gone, the ceremony resumed as planned. The orchestra, which had been momentarily silenced by the discord, began to play again, the notes of the violin and piano weaving together in a harmonious backdrop to the unfolding ceremony. It was as though the music itself had taken a deep breath, ready to carry everyone into the next chapter. Guests, who had been unsure how to react to the earlier chaos, now found their places, ready for the vows to be exchanged. Emma and Luke stood at the altar, gazing at each other, their love now shining brighter than ever. The past few moments had shown them both the importance of staying true to each other, of holding on to the essence of what mattered most, no matter what was happening around them. Their eyes locked, and a soft, knowing smile spread across Emma's face. She was ready to marry the man she had spent so many years dreaming of spending her life with. Luke, looking as handsome as ever in his tuxedo, smiled back at her, his eyes full of admiration and love. Their hands joined, and the officiant began the ceremony again, this time with a newfound sense of serenity. The vows they had written, once laden with anxiety, now seemed to flow from them more naturally than ever before. Emma promised to love Luke through all the highs and lows of life, and Luke, with equal sincerity, vowed to always stand by her side, no matter what challenges they would face. Their voices, steady and full of love, rang clear in the garden, their words carrying through the air like a gentle breeze. As they exchanged their vows, the finality of the moment sunk in. This was it, the culmination of years of growing together, of building a relationship that had led them here, to this point, surrounded by their closest friends and family. Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything came together. And then, as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Emma and Luke shared their first kiss as a married couple. It was a soft kiss, tender and full of promise, but it was more than that. It was a kiss that symbolized the resilience of their love, the strength they had shown in the face of adversity. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound of clapping hands filling the air, mingling with the light breeze that had begun to stir. The day that had started in chaos and uncertainty had finally come full circle. Now it was a day of love, of joy, of new beginnings. As Emma and Luke walked down the aisle together, their hands intertwined, they passed the guests who were applauding, smiling, and congratulating them. The celebration that had seemed so distant moments before was now in full swing. The guests had shed their previous hesitations and were now fully immersed in the festivities. The drinks were poured, the laughter was shared, and the first dance was on the horizon. The reception was everything Emma had hoped for, joyous, relaxed, and filled with the kind of love and warmth that could only come after a day like this. Despite the rocky start, the day had turned out to be perfect. The wedding that had nearly been derailed by one person's selfishness had now become the beautiful event Emma and Luke had always dreamed of. Surrounded by the people they loved, they could now focus on what truly mattered, each other. The celebration, the love, and the shared memories would last far longer than the moments of chaos. In the end, it wasn't just the perfect ceremony or the flawless vows. It was the strength they had shown together, the support they had received from those who truly cared about them, and the peace they had found despite all the disruption. And for Emma and Luke, that was the most beautiful thing of all. As for Linda, well, she became the talk of the neighborhood. People had seen her act out, and they were less than impressed. Her reputation as the Karen of the HOA was solidified that day. But for our family, it was a day to remember for all the right reasons. It was a reminder that, sometimes, the people you least expect can be the ones who come through when you need them most. Mayor Thompson's calm presence and quick thinking saved Emma's wedding and made it an unforgettable day. In the end, it wasn't about the wedding decorations or the HOA rules. It was about family, love, and having the courage to stand up to those who try to ruin special moments.